I hadn't walked the planks of the SS Moyie since I was in grade school, so it was a thrill for me to be back and see this gorgeous ship. This elegant sternwheeler is the oldest intact passenger steam vessel of its type in the whole world.
The day was April 27th, 1957. On the surface, it appeared to be just another cool and overcast early spring day on British Columbia's beautiful Kootenay Lake. Yet as history would have it, this would be no ordinary day, for this day on the lake would mark the end of an era.
The SS Moyie was launched at Nelson, BC by the Canadian Pacific Railway on October 22, 1898. The CPR's new Crow's Nest Railway line from the east had reached the south end of Kootenay Lake. From Kootenay Landing, travel to Nelson was by ship. The SS Moyie thus became the first Crow boat. In 1906, the larger, faster SS Kuskook took over as Crow boat. The SS Moyie then began her long career carrying excursions, mixed freight, and acting as relief ship as required. Her endurance and long service were made possible by her unusual composite hull made of heavy planking over a steel frame. One of the largest lakes in British Columbia, Kootenay Lake, is a widening of the Kootenay River. The river flows into it from the south and out again in the west near Nelson, then joins the Columbia River at Kaslo. Kootenay Lake is deep and fjord-like. The first known travelers, such as the Ktunaxa and Sinix peoples, visited these shores in search of food and sources of stone for tool making. They were followed by a few non-native explorers and later by prospectors in search of mineral wealth. Sternwheelers like the SS Moyie could run right up to shore, secure the gangplank, and allow isolated settlers and prospectors the ability to experience a life of luxury for at least a couple of hours, if not overnight, until they arrived in town. Lighting two fires or waving a flag would signal the ship to land at isolated settlements, farms, and homesteads. Stately ships, well maintained and decorated, provided transportation, as well as hospitality to an area of the country that was still very rough around the edges. For some, it was the only contact with the outside world. Excursions were a popular pastime in the summer months. Day trips to other towns or picnic spots were the highlight, with the ship and passengers outfitted in their finest. In the glory days of the sternwheelers, there were up to 6 large ships on the lake, with 2 rival companies, the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Kootenay Railway and Navigation Co., vying for passengers and cargo. They provided connections to existing railways in the area. As highways were established, the ships were retired or repurposed, until finally the SS Moyie was at last working sternwheel in Canada. This is where coal was burned to generate steam to run the engines. A fireman would work 6 hours on and 6 hours off, shoveling coal into the firebox. A steam gauge showed pressure levels, and water glasses verified the level of water in the boiler. For most of her career, the Moyie went about her daily routine with little fanfare or glamour. She carried the crops, moved the cattle, shuffled the barges, delivered the packages and mail, brought in ever-popular supplies of spirits and beer from the government distributor, and transported thousands of passengers from place to place. In the 1890s and early 1900s, the heyday years of the sternwheelers, the shipyard at Nelson was an exciting place, bustling with crews of carpenters, painters, boilermakers, and other tradesmen who built and maintained the CPR fleet. Each steamboat needed a monthly boiler wash to clean out accumulated scale and other materials, as well as annual inspection and repairs. The size and makeup of a sternwheeler crew varied with the job at hand. For most of her career, the Moyie could run with 14 or 15 men as crew. On busier runs, extra cooks, stewards, and other crew may have been transferred from other vessels to handle the load. By 1931, improved rail connections, roads, automobiles, and air travel led to decreased passenger traffic. The Moyie became a day boat only. The dining room closed, and any cooking required by the crew was often done by a deckhand. In the 1950s, a minimal crew was needed for once-a-week runs only between Proctor and Kaslo, with barge runs as needed to other points on the lake. The SS Moyie's long record of reliable service attests to the skill and teamwork of her crews, who managed to keep her safe and running on a lake notorious for its unpredictable weather, winds, and currents. The Sternwheeler Crew consisted of, foremost, the captain, responsible for everything to do with the ship, passengers, crew, and the ship itself. Then there was the first and second officers or mates. They were assistant to the captain, responsible for cargo, coal, maintenance of the ship, and supervision of the deckhands. The deckhands were the physical labor on the sternwheelers, unloading and loading the ship with coal and cargo, washing the decks. Then there was the purser, responsible for whatever came on or off the boat, collecting tickets, taking reservations for staterooms, arranging flag stops, and accounting for all the freight on board. Next there was the flight clerk, which took care of all cargo and mail. The stewards attended to each passenger in the dining room, saloons, and stateroom, and were well known for their high level of care. The cook was responsible for feeding passengers and crew gourmet meals. The engineers operated the machinery and maintained the steam in the boilers at safe levels. Firemen, the most physical job on the sternwheelers, feeding the fire with wood and later coal to keep the temperature in the boiler steady, was an unending task. Lastly, there was the night watchman. They kept the fire going in the firebox when the ship was docked and responsible for keeping the ship safe overnight, checking for leaks and preventing fires. Crews worked long hours, leaving Kaslo at 5:30 a.m. and sometimes not returning until after midnight, with many stops along the way. Men worked 7 days a week with no holidays. Wages were paid monthly. Entering a union in 1942 brought improvements in pay and Sundays off. The officers occupied cabins on the Texas deck. The lower-rank crew members bunked in cabins on the freight deck behind the engine room. When in 1925 a water trap burst aboard the Kuskanook, scalding 3 crew members to death in their bunks, the upper deck cabins could be cold. On the lower deck, the firemen and deckhands could be found fitfully sleeping in the hot, noisy quarters behind the engines. All crew accounts attest to cramped quarters, with just enough room in their cabins to undress and roll into their bunks with bed bugs as an ever-present company. One account recalls crew members amusing themselves by staging cockroach races, red ones versus white. In the early years, the crew enjoyed having their bed linens changed by the steward. The ship's cook supplied their meals, which they ate at a table on the freight deck ahead of the engine room. During the final days of the Moyie's career, crew members saw to their own bedding and cooking. Some of the single crew members would live on ship, which saved the need for watchmen. Although cramped quarters and long hours could lead to friction between crew members, sometimes requiring a fire hose to cool things down, the men serving on the steamers felt a strong sense of service to the company, to each other, and to the public depending on them. In the 1920s, the return trip was scheduled to leave Nelson at 4 p.m., and the trip back could be leisurely indeed. With more brief stops, often she wouldn't reach Kaslo again until late in the evening, sometimes near midnight. For passengers, there was plenty of time for a relaxed meal in the dining saloon, reading in the lounges, or a game of cards. Some travelers preferred to take a stateroom, tuck the children into bed, and take a nap, knowing that the steward would awaken them before reaching Kaslo or Argenta late at night. The highlight of the interior of the Moyie was its large dining saloon, with its marvelous view of Kootenay Lake and surrounding mountains. The floor was laid with intricate hardwood parquet. All around the room on the upper walls, the gold leaf stenciling was carefully applied by the master painter at the shipyard. The tables of the dining room were large, each seating 8 or more, and were set with the CPR's monographed silver plate, china, and linen tablecloths. An ornate hardwood mirrored sideboard stood near the pantry and was used to store the plates, china, and linens. Under the watchful eyes of the chief steward, the waiters served full-course meals and attended to the passengers in the impeccable traditions of first-class dining on the Canadian Pacific Railway. For excursions, the tables and chairs would be stacked and pushed aside to clear the floor for dancing. In October 1912, the Moyie was the royal yacht for Canada's Governor-General, Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, and his family. In 1912, the Governor-General visited British Columbia on a grand tour a year after he had taken office. The third son of the late Queen Victoria and the brother of King Edward VII, who died in 1910, he was the great-uncle of the new King George V. Born in 1850, he served in the British Army, becoming a field marshal. He was Governor-General from 1911 to 1916 and died in 1942. He visited the Kootenays with the Duchess, the former Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia, and their youngest daughter, 26-year-old Princess Patricia of Connaught. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the PPCLI, formed in 1914, was named in her honor. She designed and made by hand the regimental colors and was the first colonel-in-chief. She later relinquished her title of princess and married Alexander Ramsay, a naval officer, but a commoner. He later became a rear admiral. Lady Patricia died in 1974. The Duchess was Colonel-in-Chief of the Duchess of Connaught's own Irish-Canadian Rangers Battalion, one of the regiments in the Canadian Expeditionary Force to France during the First World War. The present-day British Columbia Regiment, the Duke of Connaught's own, based in Vancouver, still carries the Duke's name. The Moyie carried the royal party on Kootenay Lake. The steamer Okanagan was their yacht in the Okanagan, and the new and luxurious Bonington brought them down the Arrow Lakes in splendor. The steamers were painted and dressed with flags and bunting for the occasion, and there were numerous special events. Stateroom number 6, the largest on the Moyie, was refurbished for the Duke's personal use. A full bath and toilet were installed in Moyie for the Duke, and others fitted into nearby staterooms, although later removed, were added for the family and their entourage. The Moyie's cabins were decorated with freshly picked roses and bowls of prized fruit from local orchards.
Yeah, that tends to happen